That's a great question, and there are a number of ways in which you can sort of classify or answer that question, and I think you need to break it down into a whole bunch of different specific points. The first and most obvious one is that, of course, the war was of such a huge scale, and its costs were so enormous in terms of lives lost. More than 10 million soldiers were killed. A similar number were wounded during this conflict. Another 10 million civilians died or perished as a result of the war. Huge numbers, and also huge amounts of economic cost. The war created enormous demands on all of the economies of the belligerent countries and drained their treasuries and drained their populations of their wealth. So Europe emerged from this war much poorer than it started. The war also had major political consequences. It unleashed a wave of revolutions at the end. 4 empires collapsed as a result of these revolutions. So you have the Russian Empire collapsing with the Soviet Union emerging out of the revolutionary experience of Russia. The German Empire collapsed in a revolution in 1918, so did the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so did the Ottoman Empire. All 4 of these major empires, 3 in Europe, 1 in the Middle East, collapsed and were replaced by new states, new nation states for the most part. And this completely changed the map of Europe, but it also had a knock-on effect to change the map of the rest of the globe. Because not only did these new nation states, these empires dissolve into new nation states, but other empires benefited. The British and the French, for instance, their empires increased in size as a result of this shuffling of Europe as a result of this war. So that the British Empire, for example, was at its largest extent ever after the First World War. The political boundaries of Europe and the world were changed, and we have all sorts of economic consequences, but there was also a cultural legacy of the war. Many people within Western Europe believed that the war had basically shaken the foundations of European civilization, that this fratricidal conflict where Europeans were pitted against each other, and that all of their technology and all of their, compared to the rest of the world, their superior technology had been used against each other, basically created this crisis of confidence. Had Europe in fact lost the way? Had Western civilization turned in on itself and was now the whole idea of progress, which had dominated in the 19th century for Europeans, given way to a much more pessimistic view of what modern technology and modern society was capable of. Within the states that participated in the war, there was also major changes. You have a wave of democratic changes in a number of states. So, for example, at the end of the First World War, Britain becomes truly a democracy for the first time. Women over the age of 30 get to vote for the first time. All men in Britain, for the first time, get the vote. Many men in Britain did not have the vote until 1918. All sorts of new social changes took place in most of the Western European states that fought in the war as well. Because of the huge demands on the wartime economy, state governments got involved in their economies in a way unprecedented in European history, running industries, basically conscripting people to industry as well as to the military. And as a result, you have women working in areas that they had not worked very much before, changing their roles and changing people's perceptions of women in society. You also had more acceptance of the state getting involved in the economy, although in most of the European economies after the war, the state retreated and moved away from the economy. The war also generated or promoted, if not started, but certainly promoted new ideologies. And these ideologies would have a major impact in the interwar years, in the 1920s and 30s. It's from the war that we see the popularity and the respectability of ideologies like communism and socialism and later fascism. So the war had major cultural and social impact as well. It had a global reach, this war. Not only was there fighting in Europe, not only were Europeans involved, but their empires were involved, and there was fighting all over the world. This one major consequence of this was the changes that occurred in the Pacific, where you had a non-European power, Japan, who fought on the side of Britain and France and Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary in this war, rise as a major power for the first time, an Asian power of great importance, and with its own imperial ambitions. Pretty clear from the end of the war onwards that Japan was going to be a state to be reckoned with in the Pacific and in Asia. The war also led to the first real practical experiment in an international organization to keep the peace. This was the Covenant of the League of Nations, which was established after the peace treaties were signed at Paris in 1919. An organization designed, although it failed, but designed to keep the peace through international organization. It would fail largely because there were not enough people committed to its success, and also because it didn't have the tools, didn't have the means to actually enforce the obligations that it had over its the institutions and countries that were a party to it. The Paris Peace Settlement, which settled the war, which was the conference that ended at the end of the war after the combatants had exhausted themselves, was not accepted by many that were party to it. That is to say, some of the people who were at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 were reluctantly there and were not happy with the results. Obviously, the losing countries, the countries that had actually been defeated in the war, were not happy that they were essentially dictated to. But the Paris Peace Conference itself and the treaties that came out of it, the most famous being the Treaty of Versailles, were not the cause of later, not themselves the cause of later problems in Europe. They were a series of compromises that established what had already happened on the ground, if you like, in Europe, solidifying on the map the boundaries that had been fought over by the new nation states. But what was the real problem with the Paris peace settlement that ended the war was that not only were some countries, some nations, revisionist towards it, that is, they didn't agree with it, they didn't accept it, those that did agree with it, those that actually had put it together, didn't enforce it. And so the real problem that came out of the war was that there was a sense that the victors in the conflict were not now enforcing the peace like they said they should. And the states that had been the defeated powers wanted to tear up the treaty right from the get-go. So this combination of alienation on the part of those that had been defeated and were now dictated to, combined with the lack of will to enforce what had actually been agreed to by the victor powers, led to a disastrous situation that would lead to, or give the seeds to international conflict barely 20 years later. I think those are the main areas where the war was an immensely significant event, both in terms of its scale, its cost, the domestic changes that it wrought, the international changes it wrought, and this also cultural change that Europe had basically lost its way. That's another great question, and there is this perception, especially if you say watch the History Channel, that all those cheering crowds in 1914 were sending off their soldiers, and that there was an eagerness and willingness to go to war in 1914. So recent research by historians over the last 20-25 years has demonstrated that's a bit of a myth. There certainly was cheering crowds in places like Vienna and Berlin, Paris and London when war was declared. And there is no doubt that some people welcomed this. There were some people who thought that war was going to be an adventure, that there hadn't been a major European war in some decades, and people had a variety of reasons why they thought that this was a good thing. But we also know from as I said, recent historical research, that most people in Europe did not view the war enthusiastically. The two best examples three examples I'll provide you this. For this. The first would be Britain, then Germany, and France. We know that, for example, in the case of Britain decided to go to war late in the process. It was the last of the great five powers to decide to go to war. It had its own reasons for going to war. The state had its own reasons for going to war. But when it came to the population's response to this, it turns out that the thousands that were cheering in front of Buckingham Palace when war was declared were a pretty small minority compared to the masses of just the city of London, and let alone the entire population of Britain. We know that most people, when they were contemplating the war in 1914 in Britain, were worried. They were anxious about the war. They were concerned about what war would bring. The idea that the war would be over by Christmas was also not one that was widely shared in Britain. We now know through historical work that many people, because they had been looking back to a war that Britain had fought in its own empire, the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, that war wasn't going to be short, that modern weapons and modern conditions of warfare meant that wars could go on for a long time. Even a small war could go on for a long time. So there was some sense of foreboding, and some good examples of this are the great demonstrations against war that occurred in August of 1914 in Britain. In fact, the largest demonstration in that period was an anti-war demonstration, not a pro-war demonstration. The problem for those people who were opposed to Britain going to war in 1914 was that the events moved too quickly. They hadn't, for a good example of this, they put one of the organizations that formed to try and stop Britain going to war, put a full-page ad to the Times newspaper advertising a meeting, an anti-war meeting, which didn't actually, basically the ad was saying, we should get the government to not go to war. It didn't come out until several days after the war had been declared. And the meeting to which people went was basically redundant because war had been declared and the government was not going to be swayed by a demonstration. So events moved too quickly for the anti-war activists in Europe in 1914, and they were there in Britain, and they were there in Germany, and they were there in France as well, and in the other small countries, to actually mobilize support against the conflict. The leaders had brought them into the war, not in any manipulative way. The leaders of the various countries believed the war was a just war. But many people in Europe did not want to go to war. In Germany too, there is a bit of a myth about war enthusiasm, and we know through German scholars' work that this was a bit of a myth. And in the similar situation to Britain, the idea that there was a mass enthusiasm for tended to be propagated after the conflict. After the war was even over, politicians justified what they had done before the war by saying, well, so many people supported us. Similar things happened in Britain. The politicians who took Britain into war, just like the politicians who took Germany into war, basically justified what they did after the fact. We said, well, there was so much enthusiasm. If you actually look at the evidence we have for that enthusiasm, it's much more mixed. It's much more ambivalent. People generally did fall in behind their government. When war was declared, they were in, and they said, well, we're not going to be opposed to this. We are now at war. We need to support our government. We need to support our troops because their friends, their families were now going off to fight. It's, I don't want to say it's a natural reaction, but it's a logical reaction for people to want to support their loved ones when they're going off to fight. And so you don't get a major tension within Germany or within Britain about the war precisely because once the war had been declared and people couldn't stop it, they were going to support. And as the war develops and atrocities develop and casualties mount, the determination to pursue the war continues. And for civilians in both Britain and Germany, that is the case, that it's once the war gets going that you get support for the war. It's not pre-war support, it's once the war is actually getting going. France is just a little bit different. The same range of motives for France and the reason why people might support the war are there, but also the war is much more pressing on the French because France is invaded. German troops are actually on French soil from within weeks of the conflict starting, and at that point it becomes a defense of the homeland, and people support the war for that reason. The French people knew that they were going to be invaded in 1914, and that is one of the reasons why they moved to support the war, because they are going to be invaded, and also because they had been defeated by the Germans barely 40 years before, and there was a sense that we need to get our honor back, if you like. So the war enthusiasm myth is a bit of a myth. There was plenty of people who were enthusiastic, but there were lots of people who viewed the events with foreboding, did not want to go to war, but once war did start, they fell in with their societies. Yes, this is another really good question. The First World War is characterized by the trenches, of course. And this is really the experience of the Western Front. The Western Front has come to stand for the entire war. The war actually was fought in many different battlefields and many different theaters around the world. But the one that people remember is the trenches, the trench warfare of stalemate and attrition on the Western Front. And there's a simple reason for this. That was the scale of the conflict, the scale of the armies. We have millions of men in the field for each nation fighting in this conflict on the Western Front, and a very small piece of geography which they're fighting over. And also the nature of the weaponry that was being used, as has often been said, favored those who were on the defensive. So after the initial shock of being invaded, the French and the British, the very small British army that joins the French, basically dig in. They managed to halt the German advance by the so-called race to the sea, where they tried to outflank each other. And then they dig in and try to defend and stop the German advance. The Germans are stopped because they run out of steam and manpower in 1914, but then they too start to dig in. And they dig in for a different reason. The British and the French are digging into the ground quite literally because they want to prevent the advance of the Germans any further on the Western Front. The Germans are digging in because they basically see themselves as in the winning position. They have, in fact, occupied a great big portion of France and most of Belgium, and as a result, they are in the superior position. Now they can allow the British and the French to bash themselves against their lines and hope that they give up. So there was no incentive for the Germans to move. They believed themselves to be in a strong position, and so they basically dug in and waited for the British and the French to attack them, and that's exactly what will happen, and it will happen for 3.5 years, in exactly that way. Of course, on the other theatres, the conflict was quite different. Although you had trench warfare in the Gallipoli Peninsula down in the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey, other places, and also you have trenches also in Italy. The Eastern Front, the conflict between the Germans and the Russians, is much more free-flowing. You have more movement, you have big set-piece battles. It's a much different kind of conflict indeed. But as I said, everyone at the time, not everyone at the time, some people at the time disagreed with this, but many people at the time recognized that the Western Front was the main theater, that the war is going to be won and lost on that front, and so they concentrated a lot of their effort on that front. Certainly the British and the French, because that's where they are going to concentrate all their effort. And the geographical space, it's a small piece of real estate with millions of men and these new weapons, meant that it was going to be always a hard fought conflict with limited movement and basically fighting until the last man, and that's exactly what attrition is. The new weapons, or the weapons that were of use in this conflict, artillery was the weapon that killed more soldiers than any other. That is, big artillery shells, big guns firing shells, sometimes hundreds of meters or even kilometers. Machine guns, gas, airplanes. These were all weapons that were useful on the defensive, and against them, the human body was puny and not very effective. And as a result, you have this difficulty of getting a breakthrough. Other weapons, new weapons around the conflict of the First World War, submarines, flamethrowers, tanks. All of these were designed or innovated in an effort to break that stalemate. So the war was a spur to technological innovation. How do we break the stalemate? There is a bit of a myth about the so-called stupid generals. The generals didn't know what they were doing, and they threw their men against these trenches unknowingly and unthinkingly and uncaringly. And that is a bit of a myth. I mean, their job on all sides was to win the war. They had certain kinds of limitations. They were fighting blind, in that none of these armies and their leaders had done anything like this before, and as a result, they made lots of mistakes. But it's the case that that no country's generals are any more stupid than anyone else's. They were all learning as they were going at different paces and through different experience. But it's easy to blame the generals. But it's not a particularly accurate way of discussing why it was stalemate attrition. The key reason really was the scale of the armies and the limited nature of the real estate over which they were fighting. Yes, this really was a world war. When you say world war, I don't mean that everyone in the world was fighting. Clearly not. That was not the case. But there was fighting all over the world. There was fighting in Europe, obviously. There was fighting in Africa with various armies from different colonies, of the German colonies, of the British colonies, the French colonies, fighting one another. There was fighting in the Middle East. There was fighting in Asia. The only continent that didn't really see, or continents that didn't see actual fighting on land, was in North America and South America. But submarine warfare and naval warfare was happening in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So it was a truly global conflict in that sense. It was also a world war in that because of the nature of European imperialism and European empire, they could bring troops from the empire to Europe, and they did. Some 30,000 French African troops were killed in the trenches in Europe. The British brought tens of thousands of Indian troops from South Asia to Europe to not usually to fight, but to be support troops. And in fact, there were even elephants in the trenches. They hundreds of thousands of horses, but anything that could pull work was used, and this meant that the whole of these empires, including obviously Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the dominions for the British, and the French colonies, everyone and everything was mobilized to help the war effort in Europe. So this really was a global world war.